Hello all, and thank you again for coming. So it is actually my great pleasure to introduce a very capable man and a personal mentor of mine who's accomplished so much in his life and has done so much for this community in particular. Just briefly in short, Fred Keely is the County Treasurer of Santa Cruz, a position that he has held since 2005. Previously, Mr. Keely represented us in the California State Assembly as the Speaker Pro Tem and was called on by the Speaker to manage several very complex issues, including California's energy crisis and the legislature's investigation that led to the resignation of the State Insurance Commissioner. Mr. Keely has served on numerous statewide bodies, including California Forward, the California Ocean Science Trust, the Governor's Tax Commission, the Chairman's Committee on Reform of the California Fair Political Practices Commission, and at the request of the Mayor of Santa Cruz, Mr. Keely was a key leader in landing the Santa Cruz Warriors in town, and assisting in the reset of the community's water discussion. Even more recently, Mr. Keely, again at the request of the Mayor, has played a key presiding officer role in the work of the Public Safety Task Force for the City of Santa Cruz. And with that, I'd like to bring up Fred Keely.
Thank you very, very much. It's indeed a pleasure and an honor. I want to thank Robert and your colleagues at Civinomicon for extending this courtesy to me. It's really an honor and a privilege to keynote this wonderful civic event. Thank you to Cruz IO for your leadership and your vision over the years. Thank you so much for that. Education, homelessness, transportation, economy, water, sustainability. You could have that same conversation, that same suite of issues, anywhere you want in the state of California. There's not a single issue you're going to deal with in the next 48 hours that is unique to Santa Cruz. What's unique to Santa Cruz is how that manifests itself in our community. Every one of these issues. They are all issues all over the state. The challenge is how to take that Santa Cruz way of doing things, looking at our particular challenges in those subject matters and figuring out how our community wants to deal with them. So I want to talk a little bit about what prevents us heretofore to solving problems. We've made some progress on various issues. I remember when I was on the Board of Supervisors, when the homelessness issue was an issue at that time. For those of you that don't remember, that would have been 1988 to 1996. The issue at that time, the way it was discussed, was what we really need to do is we need to have more services because our community doesn't provide enough services, and as a consequence of that, people wander all over town causing all kinds of problems, and there's this and that and so on. Now, of course, we reset that issue, we look at it. Some people allege there's too many services. Some people allege there's not enough services. So we've made progress of a certain kind, but how do we struggle and how do we deal with that issue effectively? Same around water, same around a sustainable economy. Many of you might remember, there's folks in this room who do, that in the 1970s and 80s, the issue in this community was we live next door to the most powerful economic engine in the world, the Silicon Valley. The single most sustaining, powerful economic engine in the world, spinning off enormous amounts of wealth, spinning off enormous amounts of growth. And we looked like a wonderful place to come and make investments, to buy houses, to expand the scope and size of this community. And this community said in the 1970s and 1980s, oh, wait a minute. Rather than simply passively accepting what comes our way and expecting that to be our future, we are going to say that we will engage in a process of self-determination. Gary Patton, Marty Wormhout, Mike Rodkin, Bruce Van Allen, John Laird, go through the list of leaders in our community, men and women who said, there is a different way to do this. You do not simply have to receive growth and development unfettered and then figure out what to do with it and how to do it. That in fact you can decide, we are going to manage our growth in the county of Santa Cruz. We're going to manage our growth in the city of Santa Cruz. And as a result of that battle, that fight, and some people would say it was a war of values in the community. Remember, it wasn't much earlier than that the University of California located in this community, forever changing the nature of our community. At that same time, the Silicon Valley is exploding. And our community said, we actually have a choice about that. And we did something different. Orange County, and this is not a pejorative statement, it's an observation. Their community made a different choice as a coastal community with enormous amounts of growth pressure on it to do a different thing than this community did. And I believe that's reflective of their values. If you go to Laguna Niguel, you go down to parts of the Orange County coast, you might not like it, but that's consistent with the values of that community and they like it. But that's not what we had to accept if we didn't like it and didn't want it and it wasn't consistent with our values. So we've had a war over that question. And the war has been settled, the battles have been won, and our community now moves on to a different set of challenges the last 8 or 10 years. And again, they're not significantly different than many other communities in how they deal with it. So the question then becomes, how can we in fact effectively now deal with what I believe is a more diffuse set of challenging public policy questions? When the issue is narrowly focused on the question of how to grow, where to grow, what conditions are going to be present, that's actually, as enormous as those challenges seemed, that's actually relative to the challenges today, relatively easy to deal with it. This is a more complicated, complex, nuanced set of issues. They have escaped many communities' ability to successfully deal with them. But what is good news is that if you hunt throughout this state, hunt throughout the United States, you actually can find very, very successful models of dealing with the same suite of problems we deal with. You might have to pluck something from Austin, Texas. You might have to pluck something from Madison, Wisconsin. You might have to pluck something from some city or township in Pennsylvania. You might have to pluck something from Portland. And you might have to, in all those cases, not only pluck it, that's a P, ladies and gentlemen, pluck it, but also then import it and make it that Santa Cruz way that we do things. Now again, what gets in the way of that? I fear that there is something that appears to be in the way of it and something that's really in the way of it. I think in our country it is way easy these days to decide to check out of the civic engagement process for the following. Because you are told day and night, that there is rigid partisanship, and that rigid partisanship, on one hand, is what's getting in our way of solving problems. And on the other hand, and this is a new phenomenon in our culture, there are entire channels on television dedicated to underpinning that partisanship. Now, I'm going to sound like a very old man, which I am, but back in the day, boys and girls, trust me, this is true, there were 3 television stations or channels or networks. They had evening news. You got that evening news. It was a little lefty of center or a little righty of center, but you got basically the same news. And you might like how one particular newscaster looked versus another, but it was more or less going to be the same thing. Now what you can do is that you can take your belief system and have it unchallenged 24/7 and have it underpinned 24/7 and driven in a direction that allows you to believe that your belief system is in fact extraordinarily wise, extraordinarily thoughtful, does not need to be re-examined in the face of new evidence, does not have to be re-examined under new conditions. In fact, what you can do is sink real deeply and cuddly into the notion that your belief system is really good and absolutely can sustain you forever. Now, I would say that this dichotomy that exists in our world, where we are told day and night that rigid partisanship is what's preventing things from getting done in Washington, D.C. And rigid partisanship is what's preventing things from getting done in California. And at the same time, would you please dial into this so that you can be part of that rigid partisanship? Second issue. What I think that does is gives people a very easy parachute to step out of the airplane of civic engagement, pull the parachute, and land someplace where you don't have to think about it anymore. That you have no obligation in. Because you're right. Remember, you're right. You are being told that you're right all the time, meaning correct. Now, what does that do? If nothing changes and you're right, my goodness, this system really isn't worth participating in. That must be the answer to all of this. It's not really worth participating in it. Now, what is that called? The practical definition of checking out that way under that set of conditions is that it encourages broad cynicism. Broad cynicism. Now, I'm going to distinguish that from skepticism. Broad cynicism is saying that we will raise the white flag of surrender. We will attribute the worst possible motives to everybody who is in fact engaged, whether it's an elected official, someone in the government, somebody in some other belief system. We will attribute the worst motive to them and then operationalize that by checking out. Distinguish that from skepticism. Skepticism is enormously healthy and enormously helpful in the democracy. What it says is, I'm willing to be engaged and involved, but I'm not willing to do it blindly. And I'm not willing to accept what is being fed to me without challenging it in quite substantial ways. Now, let me try to wrap this. So if where we live is in this world that on many levels appears to be sharply partisan, and we have communication systems solely dedicated by the billions of dollars worth to reinforcing our belief systems and asking us not to challenge it, then it is very easy for broad swaths of the electorate and of our civic life to become uninteresting to people and irrelevant to people, and in fact sort of a chumps game to engage in. Now let's add a couple other pieces to that. Think for a moment if what we do is we say, I'm going to challenge that and see if there's another way to do it. What would that other way be? Well, if it's old geezers like me, we think you probably ought to get together at a meeting, go hear a speech, read a policy paper, do whatever. That's really wrong. Why is it wrong? Because it's just as wrong, I don't mean value wrong, I mean it's wrong thinking. It's just as wrong as saying, you know, I tried that paying my bills online business, but I really miss my checkbook. Or it's like saying, gee, I really like this high-tech device in my pocket, but I really miss my hardline telephone at my house. It's really saying, I'm not going to engage in the new way that we do everything in our life. But that is what we've done. Most of you pay a lot of your bills online. I'll bet there's not a person in this room that doesn't have some smarty gadget telephone in your pocket that literally has more computing power than the United States Army had in Vietnam. For those of you unfamiliar, Vietnam was a war we lost. More computing power in your pocket than the United States Army had in Vietnam. That is the world you live in. That is the world we all live in. And we embrace that all the time. We do it paying bills. We do it talking to people. We do it accessing information. We do it in every aspect of our life. Then why the hell wouldn't we do that when it comes to arguably one of, if not the most important thing we do as citizens? That is being involved, informed, and participating. So the thing to do then, it seems to me, is import that into that part of our life. Import all of that we already do and the way we do it and the changes that we've made. And for the most part, how happy we are with those changes. I think most of us have given up the idea that it's more efficient and more effective and all that. No, we're just busier. It's not really that it made it any more efficient and effective for us. It made us busier. But it's also wonderful. And it also isn't going away. Now, I used to belong, Robert was so kind to read the introduction my mother wrote, that but I was on something called the California Forward Board. This was an entity formed by 5 large foundations in California a few years ago who said, we got a little bit of a problem. That problem looks like this. We used to be the true up, and now we've become the source. Let me explain that. If you're the Hewlett Foundation or Packard or Wellness, Irvine, one of these real big foundations, doing lots of work on a lot of different subjects. What you used to do is, let's say you're in the child care space, or let's say you're the Pew Charitable Trust and you're in the ocean space, or let's say you're in the education space. What you used to do was the fundamentals, the foundational core of these subject matters was taken care of by the public schools, the state government, the county. That was their role. And what you did as a foundation is somebody went to you and said, gee, we're really doing the best we can in Santa Cruz and getting affordable child care, but gee, we're limited by this and that, and we can build a new 50 child care slot affordable child care facility, but if you would help us, we can make that 75, and that 75 helps us this way and this way. And then the foundation would say, glad to do it. Wonderful. Godspeed. Go help the little guys and let's get on with it. And these foundations found out about 8 or 10 years ago that something had changed for them. And that was that people were coming to them saying, we're coming to you first, not last. Why is that? Why are we coming to the foundation first for childcare? Why are we coming to them for some of these fundamentals? And part of the answer was that our state, and I'm not going to project this onto other states, our state arguably had become ungovernable. Ungovernable. When you are a state that is the 6th largest economy in the world, larger than France, and you can't get a budget adopted on time to do the fundamentals, to fund Sue's Howell's fine work over at the public schools, to help do the work that Jim Kofis and the wonderful people at the Valley Women's Club do on recycling. When you can't do the fundamentals, no wonder people lose faith and confidence across the board and start checking out right and left. So California Forward said, we got funded by these big foundations, and the foundation said, look, we don't want you to do policy work. Why don't you get in and try to figure out what to do with the tax code, figure out what to do with public education. We have plenty of people working on that. We want to understand how you can make the governance of California functional again. And what did we do? We spent a lot of time trying to understand not only what does every smarty pants in every think tank in the world believe, but what do Californians think? What do people in this state who care a lot, somewhat, or a little bit about their state, what do they think is broken? And what would they embrace as solutions? Because something, I've misspent my life in public policy. And what I know about politics is that politics is the art of the possible. It is not a pejorative word. It is not a dirty word. I say that because otherwise I've really misspent my life. But it is the art of the possible. What can you possibly get done? Not what can you get done if you engage your entire life in wishful thinking, but what can you get done? And so we worked a lot to figure out what you can get done is a function of what an educated electorate, if you tap deeply into them, not superficially, not a 20-minute poll on the phone, not a 1-hour focus group, not the combination of those two things together, because that is campaigning. And I love it. It's helped me be successful in life. It's helped me be elected to the Board of Supervisors, to the state legislature, and of course the pinnacle of my career, the county treasurer. But that's campaigning, and it's important, and doing it in an informed way is helpful. But it's also rather superficial. How do you then dive deep into not just what are people thinking, what are people feeling? What do they really feel about this issue or suite of issues? And we found out there's a couple of ways to do that. But you have to be really committed to going there with people. We did a deliberative poll, 400 Californians from throughout the state. We talked to them on the phone, picked them randomly until they represented the demography of the state. And we said, you know what? If you'd be willing to give us a weekend, we'll pay to fly you down to Orange County, sit in a hotel for a whole weekend, and dive really deep into a series of issues. And constantly let us test and refresh and test and refresh your thinking, the information you're receiving, the sources of the information, the possibilities for solutions, and let's do that real deep and very significantly. 400 people did that, together with lots of other meetings throughout the state of California, together with lots of other modern tools of discernment. What we found out is that, among other things, a couple of the reasons that people felt disengaged, uninterested in civic affairs, and believed and sort of gave up hope that their state was dysfunctional and probably was going to stay that way, was that they didn't think that, for example, the way that their representation got organized in the first place made very good sense to them. That's a shorthand version, when we dug into it, to say that people didn't believe, for example, that every 10 years when we did redistricting, that the redistricting was anything other than a purely, absolutely, 100% political exercise. That it had no interest whatsoever in what constituents or constituencies had in mind. Of course, that was supported in 2001 when the Speaker of the Assembly rose on the floor of the Assembly and said, and I kid you not, and I do not paraphrase this, that the reason for supporting the 2001 redistricting lines in California for the Senate and the Assembly was because, quote, it represented an incumbent protection program. You can hunt all day in the California Constitution to see what guidelines and what lenses you should use for redistricting, and you will never find incumbent protection program. You'll find the census is supposed to be looked at, the Voting Rights Act is supposed to be looked at, communities of interest are supposed to be looked at, but you will never find incumbent protection program. So when the Speaker of the Assembly thinks it's okay in open session on the floor of the Assembly to disrespect the democracy at that level, maybe you ought to examine how you do redistricting. Maybe you ought to have a Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission that says, why don't we use just those three lenses? The census, the Voting Rights Act, and communities of interest, and are prohibited from knowing voter registration figures, prohibited from knowing where incumbents live, and only use those three lenses. What did that do in the Central Coast of California? It put our Senate district back together. It put it back together. For 40 years, we had a Senate district that was always represented by someone from the Central Coast. Might have been a Republican back when the Central Coast was Republican. Was a Democrat with Henry Mello. It's a Democrat now with Bill Monning. That's not the important part. The important part is that the Central Coast had a voice. And when you do the redistricting, not as an incumbent protection program, but as a serious, genuine, authentic, respectful process, then you get a very different outcome that starts rebuilding trust and confidence in the electorate, that it is meaningful to register to vote, that it is meaningful to participate in the democratic process. Now let's fast forward that to this. If we combine the modern tools, the way you live your life, in all other respects, and integrate that into civic participation, and that is meaningful and real, and provides portals that you could not literally dream of 20 years ago, and that maybe some people could dream about 15 years ago but couldn't operationalize it. And in the last 5 years, the velocity of the change in technology has now permitted us, every one of us, to be more powerful than General Westmoreland in Vietnam, to be more powerful and use that power, as we say in the superhero world, for good. If we use it that way, then you do in fact have the opportunity to restore trust and confidence, because people can see that their participation is meaningful. That doesn't mean you always get your way. That's a very different issue than whether you always get your way. Can you see yourself reflected? That investment of participation then gets reflected in public policy. When the answer to that is yes, you encourage participation. When it is no, you discourage it. And my argument to you is, this is a very worthwhile investment of your time. Here tonight, tomorrow, and the next day. Let me close by saying this. In these processes, whether it's the process that my buddy Jim House is just coming off of in the Public Safety Commission of the City of Santa Cruz, or it's any of the other work that you folks do that is involving many, many people, I would ask you to keep the following in mind. This is my bumper sticker guide for you. Consider the source. But here's my bumper sticker guide to you. What you should be managing towards at all times in civic engagement is to find that sweet spot that says the following: I am managing towards a principled compromise, but I will never ask any party to this to compromise their principles. I will repeat that. You should always be managing towards a principled compromise, and you should never be asking anyone else, nor should they be asking you, to compromise your principles. If you follow that, you then find out what is possible in the art of the possible. Thank you very much.
Yeah.